And good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to be here with you all, and hope you can sustain your energy and enthusiasm through this session and also the closing session. In this session, for an hour and 15 minutes, we're going to be now turning our attention from talking about research and talking about a lot of institutional commitments that you've seen in the morning and early and afternoon. We're going to turn attention now to planning and implementation. And as you see from this wonderful panel, because we're focusing on planning implementation, we're all a women panel. That was the only joke that I'm going to say on gender. Anyway, so we have a great panel here, and we want to hear this diverse views from different representatives that we have here, the panelists. And I'm just going to quickly introduce them to you and for us to get into the substance of the session. Our first speaker is going to be Jenna Slotin. Jenna is the Senior Director for Policy for the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, and prior to this, she was Director of the Sustainable Development Policy at the UN Foundation. She has over 12 years of experience at the UN and working on UN policy issues related to sustainable development and peace building, with a particular focus on analyzing the political dynamics around the 2030 agenda, financing for development, sustainable development data, and the UN peace building architecture. And if anybody knows the UN, is Jenna. So if you have any complex questions, at some point you can ask her, because I always rely on her. And then the next speaker is going to be Tanja Suvilaakso. I hope I pronounced it right. And Tanja is the Director of Program Technical Quality at Plan International Canada. She is an experienced child rights and protection specialist working with Plan for the past 7 years and has held similar roles with UNICEF and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland. In Tanja's current role, she is looking at the integration of programming across sectors as she leads to multi-thematic team to address the complex realities of women and children. Our next speaker is going to be Sarah Hendriks. Sarah is the Director of Gender Equality, and she leads the foundation's, the Gates Foundation's efforts to achieve substantive and sustainable results in promoting gender equality and unlocking the empowerment of women and girls. Prior to joining the foundation in 2015, Sarah worked as the Director of Gender Equality and Social Inclusion for Plan International, leading the development of a comprehensive gender equality policy, strategy, and global capacity development programs. In this role, she was the editorial chair and lead researcher for a multi-year global research and policy report entitled Because I'm a Girl, the State of World's Girls. Sarah, it's good to have you here. And the last speaker is going to be Kristen Weiss. And Kristen, I hope you can stay with us because she just arrived from Juba after a tough mission, and tell us a little bit about that work. And Kristen is the Child Protection Specialist and Global Civil Registration and Legal Identity Technical Lead at UNICEF headquarters in New York. Kristen brings extensive experience from across several technical sectors across North America, Africa, East Asia, and Europe. She has worked in the private sector as a legal and regulatory business analyst for a top Fortune 100 firm, and she previously consulted with the World Bank and supported the content development for the CRVS e-learning course. So I thought the format of the session will be similar to the previous one. We'll start with you, Jenna, and then we'll go to each one of the speakers, and then we break it out for Q&A and wrap it up by sharp 4:15, I promise. So Jenna, over to you. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Shaida, for that lovely introduction. Thank you to the IDRC Center of Excellence for inviting me and for hosting what's been really some fantastic discussions today and outstanding panelists. I hope I can make a small contribution as well. Delighted to be on the all-female panel at the end of the day as well. I couldn't resist. Okay, so I am from the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. Forgive me, it is a mouthful. I'll tell you a little bit about what the Global Partnership is in the course of the presentation, as I've been asked to do, and how sort of the approach of the Global Partnership might be able to contribute to implementation. So starting my presentation like others, kind of identifying or articulating some of the problem, I think many of the other speakers have done so very eloquently today. Just very much to put it in the context of the 2030 Agenda in particular, and thinking back to Francesca and Oliver's presentations this morning, I mean, there are a number of goals, targets, and indicators where civil registration and vital statistics are really essential, and where not just in the monitoring, but in the implementation, that is, in achieving empowerment, in reducing inequalities, in promoting legal identity, et cetera. And so this is just an example across the goals of where that's relevant. And really just to say that I want to kind of put this emphasis, because of the topic of this panel, on the implementation of the 2030 Agenda and achieving the goals, so not just the monitoring. So it's incredibly relevant for the indicators, but the data that is needed at national and subnational levels to make the kinds of decisions and construct the kinds of policies that are needed is almost as essential. And I think civil registration is absolutely essential. The other piece of it, again, and thinking about the aspiration to leave no one behind, one of the things that we hear, I'm based in New York, so one of the things we hear around the UN a lot is the 2030 Agenda's aspiration to leave no one behind. And what's phenomenal about it is that it resonates across the policy spectrum, it resonates across government. But actually, I think many of us and many in government are asking, what does that really mean? What does it mean to leave no one behind? I think there are a number of policies, programs, but I think here the data is an essential piece of that. If we're to operationalize this aspiration, we need to know who is left behind, how, what are their circumstances, what are their needs, how do they experience their circumstances. And so just breaking down, I think there, again, the reference to civil registration and vital statistics, and we've heard today in much greater detail the way in which access to rights and services, public health planning, and being counted. So here, I think I want to sort of reference back some of the comments in the morning, particularly from Haisha, and this point about it's not all about the data. It's about empowerment. It's about dignity, really. I am nonetheless going to focus on the data piece because I come to you from the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, and just to sort of get at that point in particular. And I think there, the title of today's conference really says it all, making the invisible visible. And how can we, through improvements to data and through improvements to data use, really get at leaving no one behind. So a few words on the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. In short, it is a multi-stakeholder initiative that was established in 2015 on the sidelines of the SDG conference when the global goals were approved and endorsed by all member states. And it was a group of country governments, civil society actors, international organizations, private sector companies, academia, and others who came together really to do this. Better data for better decisions for better lives. And many of the partners of the Global Partnership are in the room today. And we exist really to do two things collectively. So I want to just give you a flavor for some of the partners that are in the global partnership to get a sense of what the opportunities are. There are currently just over 300 partners. In 2015, when the initiative was launched, there were around 70. So quite a lot of growth. And I think that shows the potential opportunities in that many different actors are seized with this opportunity, that working together on strengthening core data systems in government, as well as harnessing new opportunities, the so-called data revolution, new technologies, and bringing different data sources together presents for achieving the 2030 agenda. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we do this and how that can link to CRVS and gender. So really, there are two main things that the Global Partnership exists to do. The Global Partnership is not an operational actor, like many of the organizations that are represented in the room. We're a network. And we bring different players across sectors together to do two things. One is being like a global advocate for data, and doing so at a global, national, regional level. Really emphasizing and raising attention on the data issue, the data challenge. We've heard numerous times today where there is a political obstacle in getting national governments to really invest, to really pay attention to the needs in terms of civil registration, and to think about the gender dimensions. And one element in particular where we've been looking at pushing the advocacy agenda around data is on financing. So we've seen, as the 2030 agenda was approved and started with implementation, a lot of excitement around the opportunities related to strengthening data as core infrastructure for sustainable development. A lot of excitement around new technology, a lot of excitement around big data and satellite data, a lot of focus on the core needs of national statistics offices, and yet the financing hasn't kept pace. So we know that there's a real gap in terms of strengthening core civil registration systems. So moving on to CRVS and gender, we're doing work over the coming year to make this case in a number of different ways, to make a more compelling case to policymakers, why invest in data. And I think there's a real opportunity, as highlighted by Oliver and others, and Myra, to make the case for CRVS and gender, and to do so in a way that is perhaps a little bit different than what's come before, by bringing different players together, understanding what are the costs and benefits, what are the efficiencies that are gained, what's the economic case, how to bring the private sector to that discussion, and really package this up in a way that's compelling for policymakers. The other advocacy element is linking to the Leave No One Behind agenda. I think that's well recognized by everyone in this room, but that creates a real opportunity to make that case in terms of civil registration, and particularly the opportunities and the benefits in terms of empowerment for girls and women. So the second way in which the Global Partnership really drives action around improving data for decision making is driving collaboration. Like I said, we're a network. We're not delivering programs all over the world. We have a number of governments that are partners, as well as a number of other state and non-state actors. And we exist to create the collaborations that perhaps haven't come before. We've heard throughout the day about the need for new partnerships. I think Oliver used the term trusted partnerships. And so we exist to create that platform to build trust. When and how is the best way to work with the private sector? It's not going to be all the time, but how can we build the trust to do that? What are the opportunities that civil society might bring to that discussion? Including, I'm remembering Irina's call from the last panel about the knowledge that exists in communities. How do you work at the community level with community groups, with this new form of data called citizen-generated data, and a lot of organizations that are experimenting in that space, to bring that information in a robust and reliable way so that we can strengthen civil registration and gender empowerment. So for us, we drive collaboration across a number of thematic areas, with Leave No One Behind being one of them. and really focus on collective problem solving. So what we're doing is we're looking for challenges and opportunities where there might be new solutions, where different partners can come together in new ways to be extremely concrete about what the opportunities are to strengthen, in this case, CRVS and the gender dimension. And we have a range of ways of doing that, which I'm happy to talk about in question and answer or at later stage. But I think my time's up, and that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Tanja Suvilaakso, as introduced. Thank you for this invitation to be here today. I'm also delighted to be on this female panel. I will be speaking about the role of civil society organizations in CRVS. And as civil society organizations usually work at the local level in the communities, I've decided to focus my presentation entirely on the individual and how all of the issues we've discussed here today affects the individual. So this is Kadso. She's a 15-year-old girl living in a rural village in Kilifi County, Kenya. Last year, she was elected as the first female president of her school government. She was also performed so well last year on her grade 8 examination that she qualified to enroll in the highest tier of secondary schools in Kenya. And currently, she's enrolled in Form 1, which is an accomplishment for girls of her county. But fast forward 2 years from now. Kadso is 17 years old and about to enter her 3rd year of secondary school. But unfortunately, her parents determine that they can no longer afford her education and her school fees, and they decide that she will need to drop out and get married, squashing her dream of becoming a lawyer. Fast forward again when Kadso has her first child, and we as Plan International or any other CSO or NGO asks her to register her baby girl. Why would Kadso, a first-time mom, decide to do it? If we put ourselves into a day of the life of Kadso, we can see each of the gender barriers she may face to access birth certification. First, she would need to convince her husband the value of a birth certificate for their daughter. She'd need to negotiate with him to get her transportation money and to allow her to travel into town to the registration office. She'd need to flag down a male motorbike driver, strap her baby on her back, and travel for maybe an hour and a half on bumpy roads to town. She'd need to line up at the registration office and potentially be questioned or shamed by the registrar why she had her baby so young, why the father isn't with her, and why she didn't understand the forms and fill them in correctly. Then she would need to travel back home on bumpy roads and get home to her husband and inform her that the baby is registered now, but they would need to go back in a month to get their certificate. And since the registrar wasn't able to tell her when that's going to be ready, they'll have to take their chances when they go back. So the husband will feel this was a waste of time. He'll be annoyed, and he, especially because she was unable to complete her household chores while she was gone. And Kadso herself will be happy enough to not go back and get shamed again, so she doesn't bother to renegotiate with her husband to pick up the certificate. So what if birth registration and certification services tackled these gender barriers and were easily accessible and offered free right in her own village? What if they were offered free of judgment and discretion of the registrar? What if Kadso felt respected and treated fairly throughout the full process? And what if her and her husband truly understood the value of the birth certificate to their new child? Would she then prioritize registration and certification for her baby? We believe the answer is yes. But let me quickly explain how we got to that answer. In the early 2000s, you may have heard that we, driven by the Article 7 of the UNCRC, we ran a large campaign called Count Every Child, Plan International's large universal birth registration campaign. Under this campaign, we conducted numerous birth registration and certification drives across the world, and we were very effective at registering large numbers of children. However, babies continue to be born every day, and despite our efforts, we were not actually increasing the rate of birth registration and certification. So we went back to the drawing board, which involved to look for a more different and holistic approach. And this involved a gender transformative demand, supply, and accountability approach. So when we look at demand, basically, how do we motivate people to actually start the process of what we've been talking about here today? We had a very weak argument to convince Kadso to register a baby because of all those gender barriers. Even if she understands the value of registration, she won't prioritize it until she's denied a service for her child. And in the Kenyan context, that may be later for women and girls because they're more likely to drop out of secondary school and then therefore be less engaged in activities where they'll need to require proof of identity. So we needed to convince her through a multi-pronged approach, which involves personal connection and influence, community mobilization, and sustained advertising. In short, I need to connect with you as a parent and then influence your knowledge and then your choices around birth registration. So due to time limitations, I'll just quickly touch on the personal connection piece. Recognizing cultural sensitivities around pregnancy and childbirth, it's important to identify different stakeholders at the local level who can engage with both mothers and fathers to promote and facilitate registration. They need to be trustworthy ambassadors that the family will let into their homes and connect with them on a personal level. So within Kadso's village, these people have been identified as community health volunteers and village elders. In any program, we have to be selective and realistic about the level of change we can achieve in gender dynamics and decision-making patterns in households. So around birth registration, if our ultimate goal is to get babies registered, we will have to encourage joint decision-making, but at the very least, we will have to remove barriers such as allocation of resources or the time it takes to get for travel to get registered. So along with building demand, which is critical to start all of these processes, we looked at supply as well. And we need to invest in strengthening the supply of the services so that when mothers and fathers do access them, they're convenient, affordable, and they have a positive experience interacting with them, and they're free of judgment. This required looking at the points of service, so how these services are delivered, as well as capacity building and change management, and technology. So technology addresses the gender barriers of time, mobility, and money. Globally, we are building an open CRVS, a standards-based open source civil registration system that will be freely available in any country. And our colleagues will be holding innovation labs over the next couple of days to discuss that. But in Kenya, we have, thanks to Canadian government funding, we have built a mobile application which intends to bring the service of registration to the community level. To highlight a couple of the key gender considerations we've already applied in that design, which is that we made the father's name an optional field. That has been raised several times today. So that's in that mobile application. We also looked at the different actors who have authority to register the children on the mobile application. So in Kadso's village, this was chiefs, but we know that mothers access health services, immunization through health clinics, so we're also advocating for community health workers and MNCH providers to also have the authority to bring the service closer, so empowering women to take on that role. This brings me to my accountability slide, and I think a lot has already, or enough, not enough, we can always reiterate what's been said, but accountability has been covered, and the issue of addressing discrimination in legal frameworks is critical. So we need to continue to analyze the clauses within legal frameworks to make sure they're not inhibiting girls and women, and we do that through our approach. But I just want to touch on the accountability, the complementary legal frameworks. We need to determine, the lack of effective and well-streamed birth registration systems makes it difficult to determine the age in cases of abuse and apply relevant criminal laws. And as well, for children that are married or victims of abuse, we have a hard time applying age-appropriate health and child protection services, family planning services, counseling, for example. And then again, what's mentioned today also is determining the age of marriage. In fact, in Bangladesh, we are currently already doing this, working with the government of Bangladesh to nationally scale up a solution that allows imams, who are the relevant cultural actors, to verify the age of brides at the point of marriage. So just to wrap up, I just want to reiterate that in resource-poor settings, many parents perceive the challenges to far outweigh the benefits of registering their children. So hence, they do not prioritize it. Therefore, we need to influence their choices, we need to look at the interventions and create demand, work closely with them at the community level, as well as work on the supply and accountability as well. Effective and sustainable CRVS solutions need to address the gender barriers, which has been very well stressed today, but each of those components in the demand, supply, and accountability components, and then we should never lose sight of the individual. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for, you want to leave that. Thanks. Thanks, Tanja. And thanks, Jenna, very much. We've heard from two very interesting perspectives from a global partnership, data platform perspective, and some of the things that they bring to the table for planning and implementation of CRVS, including building, raising the profile, the political profile of the CRVS, and of course financing, which is a very important building block also for the CRVS implementation. And we've heard from our colleague from Plan on the role of the CSO. And very interesting and important for us to always keep that in mind, that demand and beneficiary and the stories from the beneficiaries are the most important thing that for us to keep in mind as we plan for the implementation. Now we switch to a different perspective, and that's from Sarah Hendriks from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So over to you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Shaida, and thank you, everyone, for such a dynamic discussion today. It's been a privilege to be able to hear so many of the perspectives, and I particularly appreciated the intersection of analysis around not just birth registration, but also marriage, divorce, and legal identity. And it's from that intersection that I'd like to pick up the conversation in the last technical discussion or technical panel and focus this particular presentation on women's economic empowerment and the role of gender data and CRVS, and what that might mean to strengthen women's economic empowerment, pulling certainly from many of the points that were previously raised. Again, my name is Sarah Hendriks. I joined the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in 2015, and I work on a small but mighty and frankly a real privilege to work with a phenomenal team of experts, and my colleague Catherine Hay is also here today and is known to many of you. As I begin, I'll just share briefly some of our thinking around a framework for women's economic empowerment in order to provide a container upon which to look at this through the lens of CRVS and gender data. Over the past year, certainly, and more, the Gates Foundation has been joining with many other partners to really get specific in what are the barriers that hold women back, particularly also when it comes to enablers for empowering women economically. And we've landed on understanding that as foundational health is absolutely critical, evidence tells us that when women are empowered economically, they tend to have greater access to income, as well and importantly as assets, both economic assets and productive assets. And they have more control and benefit from economic gain, and have subjective dimensions of agency, are also able to have more power to make decisions of that economic gain, of both those economic and productive assets. I share all of this really, as I said, as a container and a mental framework to think about what, in particular, economic assets have to do with CRVS and gender data. And I share this really in the spirit of a learning posture, as we have taken an intentional learning posture to listen and learn from others who are, frankly, have a greater depth of expertise, both technically as well as experientially, but also just to give you a purview into some of the learning that we've been doing as we go along the way. And so I'd like to focus the next comments in my discussion on two of those assets, specifically on the economic asset of a digital financial bank account and what CRVS data has to do with that, as well as land tenure security and possibly what CRVS gender data has to do with advancing that. We certainly started this work really asking a couple of questions around the interconnection of poverty and inequality at multiple levels, at the level of the individual woman and how she experienced poverty in low-income households, at the level of the community and the way in which power is brokered in communities to either shut down or open up opportunities for women. And here's where I'm going to focus today, which is on structures, the ingrained biases and systems and structures that so often and too often exclude women and girls. Here I'll focus, as I said, on financial systems as well as economic systems such as land tenure and land registration systems. We certainly know, and we've heard in today's previous reflections, particularly in the panel previous to this one, that in order to really move the needle on women and girls' empowerment, on gender equality, strong national data systems are important, inclusive of a gender-intentional CRVS system. This not only helps with national planning and implementation, but it certainly is also a prerequisite for individuals, both men and women, to access vital economic resources like social protection schemes, as well as protect productive assets. We know that birth registration can be that legal identity that can help with accessing financial services. We know that marriage registration can offer protection for property rights, including inheritance of land. And we know that divorce certificates also have a role to play in terms of the economic security for women to secure their rights to alimony, to pensions, to child support, to inheritance. So let's start with that question of inheritance, and specifically of land tenure security. At the Foundation, we've been looking at the role that land tenure security can play in improving women's economic empowerment. And we started by level setting, well, what does this terminology of land tenure security mean? It's certainly a term that gets flung around an awful lot. And sometimes it's assumed that it's simply equated with owning a land certificate or a piece of title to land. I actually believe that it's a whole lot more than that there are 5 dimensions that are critical to understanding land tenure security. And as you look at this slide, I'd like you to look at it through the lens of what does CRVS gender data have to do with ensuring that those 5 dimensions, especially as they are conditions specific to women and girls, are realized. As we see these 5 dimensions of land tenure security being legally recognized, socially recognized, enforceable by external authorities, long-term, and appropriately transferable, we also are reminded, I hope, of the fact that women often hold their rights to property or land by virtue of their relationship to their husband. And whilst that may not be a great thing, it is, however, the reality. So a woman often only has those rights as long as she is married. And hence, the registration of her marriage becomes so vitally important in order for her to realize those rights, and particularly in order for them to be legally recognized and for her to enact her right to appropriately transfer that through the inheritance, sale, lease, or mortgage of land. We know that this can be illuminated or hampered by good or bad or inadequate gender data. And we're just asking a few questions for ourselves about whether we know enough about the role of legal records of marriages and deaths from a gender lens, and how this can help women retain their share of land and other assets. I promised to also cover another important area that I think has some interesting intersections, and that is financial inclusion. So beyond the productive assets of land, what does CRVS data have to do with financial inclusion? I think here there's an interesting story to put in context. We look at financial inclusion from a digital perspective. We look at the 1.1 billion women around the world who are still unbanked today, and we see that and ask questions about how that could be different, particularly if they had access to a mobile money account. And there has been some tremendous progress towards greater digital financial inclusion for both women and men across the world, and that needs to be celebrated. Globally, women have been making great gains in terms of account penetration. Between 2011 and 2014, this went from 47% to 58%. That's great news. But when you view it actually through a gender and a poverty lens, you see a different story emerging where women aren't necessarily making gains relative to men. And you see that gaps in digital financial usage grow in countries where advanced usage is also increasing. What I want to emphasize here is that so often and too often, women are constrained from registering a mobile money account. And those constraints have to do with a whole lot of supply and demand side factors. But some of those supply and demand side factors on why women and girls don't satisfactorily have a mobile money account, or DFS there you see as digital financial services, is lack of a formal ID. In fact, the Findex says that 1/5 of the world's women in the developing world, of unbanked women in the developing world, say they do not have the documentation necessary to open a bank account, such as official ID or a birth certificate. I'll read that data point again. It's from the Findex, from Leora Clapper at the World Bank. Nearly 1/5 of unbanked women in the developing world say they do not have the documentation necessary to open a bank account, such as an official ID or a birth certificate. So we're asking another learning question. What is the role of ID ownership have to do with women being more likely to register and then become active users of digital financial services? And I hope perhaps that question sparks a question for you. I don't have any more time left, so perhaps in the question and answer period, I would like to address the question of, so what's the role of donors in terms of engaging in and supporting and illuminating a spotlight on gender intentional CRVS data? And I look forward to that discussion during the question period. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. So people often ask me how I get so interested in birth registration or civil registration. And it really stems down to about 20 years ago, my parents decided to adopt. And they decided to adopt from Ethiopia. And Ethiopia is just now launching their CRVS system, but 20 years ago, they were not. So finding out that my soon-to-be little brothers didn't have a birthday, we didn't know how old they were. Going through the adoption process, knowing that neither of their parents had death certificates, and when my parents had to pull their dossier together to do the adoption, they had to find their marriage certificate. My mom had to find her divorce certificate, also her birth certificates, and just seeing that whole process was quite interesting. And then when my mom went to go and finally do the adoption process, having to go through a pretty lengthy, complicated judicial process to get the adoption certificate, and then when they came to the US, seeing how they became naturalized citizens after all of that. So that's a little bit of an intro of why I'm super interested and have been for so long. But today we wanted to talk about what can the UN agencies do to support both CRVS, but also ensure that there is gender mainstreamed into the whole process. So the shift from the MDG era to the SDG era development, we have some challenges to overcome. There needs to be a shift from the sector-specific programming to the multi-sector. There is a requirement of shifting of how we're resourced from siloed resources to multi-sector funding as well. And then looking to shift from focusing on low-hanging fruit and quick wins to system strengthening and equity. So some of the more recent, I just got back from South Sudan, so I'm quite exhausted, but one of the reasons I was able to go there is because GAC funded this wonderful project that helped bridge the child protection, human rights bit of UNICEF with our health colleagues. So it was able to strengthen the power of the health sector to scale up notification of births, and then also work with the child protection to then turn that into the registration and certification of births. The EU also, and DFID has really supported some legal identity for all. So the 650 million children from 0 to 16, which is more than half of the 1.1 billion identity gap. We don't just have to focus on under fives. We can actually look at the importance of an identity for all children. So the one UN, the power of the one UN. So how do we leverage that? The elusive one UN. No, somebody said that there's no one agency that does it all, but together we do. So how do we make sure that we use our advantages as UN agencies to come together, to do more joint reporting, more joint research, joint monitoring frameworks, so we don't have the duplication of indicators and information systems. Make sure there's a clear division of labor. I think within CRVS it is quite clear who does what, but in gender that's cross-cutting, that goes through all. So how do we mainstream that into our work? And then looking at how do we leverage some of the donor-specific resourcing opportunities, either pool it together, I like to call it patchwork funding, getting a little bit here and there and try to make a cohesive program or project out of that. And how do we advocate for sustained funding? Because systems strengthening is slow. It takes a long-term investment, and it also it's not one sector that can do it all. We need multi-sector, long-term sustained funding to actually shift the needle. And that's what it can look like. So to strengthen systems, you need both the government's commitments to be on and the governments to be on board, donors and implementing partners to come together, and the UN to be, and then of course gender is kind of like it's all encompassing, and it's so critical for achieving the SDGs and for sustainable development. So luckily we already have a lot in place. We have interagency network for women and girls within the UN. We have UNDP has their gender task team, the African Program for Improvement of Civil Registration of Vital Statistics, and of course Asian Pacific as well. We have our global CRVS group. There's ID4D, and a lot of the UN agencies, we have our own strategic plans. So how do we pull what we already have together and ensure that we have a more cohesive life cycle approach from birth to death, and ensure that all of these bits are tied together? So if we can do that, we can support countries in mainstreaming gender equity into their national plans or revised policies. We can advocate for more high-level involvement. In order to get multiple ministries to work across each other, we need heads of state or vice presidents to really help drive that. Same thing with the UN agencies. It makes it a lot better when we have senior management that really wants to support a common agenda, such as gender. We've seen wonderful things. With CRVS, it's been a little bit slower. So how do we get that support from a higher level? And then looking at the indicators and markers to make sure we can actually measure progress towards that. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Kristen. And thanks also, Sarah, to you. So you've now heard from four relatively diverse groups on some of the building blocks that we need to put together for the planning and implementation, from partnership to focus on the beneficiaries, from Sarah's points on how do you link CRVS to important issues like the women's economic empowerment that is a special focus of many parts of the world. And of course, Kristen from the specialized agency, UN specialized agency point of view and what needs to be done. And I love the slide of the one UN. I don't know what Francesca thinks about that, but that sounds terrific. So let's really go for that, for the one UN and integrated system. So let's turn to you. We have now some time for you questioning and asking or making some comments or asking for the clarification questions from the panelists. So please come, Ramesh, and please, Rike, come to the microphone. Again, introduce yourself. I know everybody knows
Thanks
you.
A lot. Thanks, Shaida. Ramesh Silva from UNFPA. I think my question's directed particularly at Sarah Hendriks, but also to other colleagues. And so I was struck by the statistics you quoted from Findex. 1/5 of unbanked women in developing countries do not have legal ID to open a bank account, if I understood that correctly. And so it made me think a lot about the largest national ID system project in the world today, the Aadhaar project in India, which was set up by the founder of Infosys, Nandan Nilekani. And this is a national ID system, to my understanding, which has been largely set up completely independent of India's civil registration system. And the logic behind this has been that biometry, iris scanning and fingerprinting technology is going to be a transformative mechanism to promote inclusiveness, particularly in the economic and the banking sector, across gender in particular. And so so in relation to all of this, I was interested in your 5 dimensions of land tenure security. You talked about legal recognition, social recognition, enforceable by external authorities, that it's long-term and appropriately transferable. And so I was wondering whether you could help elaborate how we should think about these national ID systems, which I think in many cases, in some worrying cases, are being set up independent of CRVS systems, and what the potential short, medium, and long-term risks are in this situation. Thanks.
Thank you. Annika?
Me again.
Yes.
And some of us are holding the pen in this meeting, so we're taking notes. And I want to build on that last slide from Kristen, because I'm looking for, things we can take forward from this meeting for the final meeting report. So my question is, 1 UN, there was a little bit of, yes. But you had a really important point in there, which was about monitoring and evaluation about the targets and indicators, and particularly because this meeting is about gender. What can we reflect would be very important. Maybe the M&E, the targets, the indicators are actually the critical piece that we can work on now, to make sure that CRVS is not, leaving gender out. So this morning, I know you've just got off a plane, but we talked about, design, we talked about, a couple of things. But I think for me, that last slide was really important. And the other question, take it as you will, would be then how do we link it to some of the other things that have come out of this meeting, like, the recurring theme of economic empowerment, right, rather than the traditional kind of, deficit-based analyses that we tend into. I think there's some very positive communications that have come out of this meeting. So some reflections from the panel that I can furiously write in the notes. Thank you.
Thank you. Jonathan?
Hi, thank you very much for all the presenters. My name is Jonathan Maskell. I'm from the World Bank's ID for Development program. Both sessions, this one and the one beforehand, were brilliant, all the presentations. I wanted to make one point in the previous session, but I'll make it now because it does link to my question. All the data and research that we're doing should be linked to the programming and the interventions that we make. And I wanted to bring to everyone's attention that there's a few things that we're doing that may help. Number one, I'm sure a lot of you know about the Women, Business and the Law survey, the global survey that happens, that the World Bank facilitates. And this collects a lot of data now on the process by which a woman goes through to obtain birth registration for a child or an ID document or a passport for themselves. So this could produce some very useful qualitative data. The other thing is, and with the support of the Gates Foundation, we've included questions on ID in the Findex for 2017. And the preliminary results of this, the questions include whether somebody has an ID across 90 countries, and what do they use that ID for. And what we found is that for persons over the age of 15, that obtaining a SIM card and financial services are the two largest use cases for ID. And as somebody who's worked in CRVS for a number of years and now moving into working on more digital identity issues, I've been struck by the importance and the power of linking the interventions and programming with substantive use cases, things that will make an impact on the daily lives of people. And certainly, Ramesh mentioned financial inclusion in India. Haisha mentioned earlier guaranteeing that cash transfers in Pakistan reach the female head of household and are not hijacked by a male has increased household spending on nutrition, healthcare, education for the children. I'd love to hear from the panel, are there any other use cases or areas? The presentation touched on land ownership and financial inclusion, but are there any other areas that we should be looking at in more detail, and other stakeholder groups that aren't involved in building CRVS or ID systems, but can promote and facilitate those use cases? Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any? Susan, start. This is your first question today. I thought you would be asking more questions.
Public question. Thank you very much. My name is Susan Stout. I'm with Development Gateway. Thanks for your presentations. 2 questions. As donors and partners, is there a single place that you go to kind of track progress in implementing these systems? Is it easy to go find out what progress are we making on implementing larger scale CRVS? Because I'm not sure that we're all working on the same page in terms of who's doing what and how much money there really is. I hear there's a lot, then I hear there's not enough. So I'd be interested in, do you as donors have a good sense of who's doing what and where and how progress is being accomplished? And the second is, and I hesitate to bring up a perhaps sensitive issue, but I'm hearing CRVS and I'm also hearing ID4 and ID4 digital identification. Are these 2 worlds coming together in an effective way?
She knows the answer. Okay, so we have now 4 questions, and one of them is directly for you, Sarah. So I was wondering if you want or answer to any other questions. So why don't we start with you, Sarah?
Yeah, thank you so much for your questions. And I think in some ways, a couple of the questions mix in together, particularly with the inputs from the ID4D colleague from the World Bank. Certainly, the Aadhaar biometric ID system has enabled more women and men and boys and girls across India to be registered, I think, more than any other country in the world. I think it's changing the regulatory know your customer requirements within the financial inclusion space and the dynamics behind some of the barriers faced in terms of KYC. That notwithstanding, I hear you on what are the short, medium, and long-term risks. And I fear I'm not substantively well-informed enough to do a good job in responding to that. What I can say from my own limited knowledge is what I've been looking at in terms of the power and promise of biometric identification, as well as the potential risks and pitfalls from a gender lens as it relates specifically to women's access to government-to-people social protection payments. I believe the case of Pakistan was highlighted previously today in terms of the social protection payment of the Benazir Income Support Program. And as you may or may not know, there's 12,000 ATM machines in Pakistan where you can cash out. Those 12,000 ATM machines largely exist in peri-urban and urban areas. In a context wherein women are highly constrained from ease of mobility and being given just a Benazir ATM card, that has meant high leakage as well as corruption rates in terms of actually accessing and being able to control that social transfer. And of course, these are some of the poorest women in Pakistan who are already highly marginalized and live in largely rural areas. And so hence, one of the open questions for discussion and potential shared investment across donors right now is expanding those access points through a digital thumbprint to enable cash out with that digital thumbprint. And that would expand the 12,000 current cash out points to 75,000 cash out points and bring those much closer in physical proximity to women and girls' lives. Will that solve everything in terms of the vast constraints to other issues that women and girls face? No. Will it be part of the answer? In addition to the interoperability of the whole system for social protection, delivery of payments, as well as the careful safeguarding of other gender constraints, I think it's part of an answer. So there you have it. I think, nevertheless, given the nature of the way we see these two systems building up, I think your point was, aren't they becoming parallel? And is that or should that be a concern? I think the importance needs to be in enabling a broad and open conversation across system players and enable the kind of dialogue we see here today, including from a gender lens. I was thankful to hear from the colleague, I'm sorry I didn't catch your name, from the bank. And I had actually hoped to share as well some of the work that you are doing around obtaining national ID information in terms of the 2017 Global Findex data. And I think that is going to go a long way given the ways in which the Global Findex data has such broad reach, the way in which it provides us with an understanding across 90 countries of both supply and demand side constraints to be able to connect that into national ID and be able to have more veracity when we quote statistics such as 1/5 of women feel that they cannot register their account. So I do think that it all comes together in these inherent ways. Yeah.
Thanks, Sarah. Now going to the other panelists, if you, Tanja or Jenna and Kristen, would you like to take on any of the other questions and maybe answer some of Susan's question also, if regarding whether there is a place that we can go for more information to be on the same page on the financing and also progress on CRVS, and even more things if you want to say on CRVS and ID4D.
I can tell you where I go, other than my hordes and hordes of files that I keep. For the CRVS information, I go to the Get in the Picture website on SCAP, and I look at also the reports that Oliver leads on the two regional commissions in Africa and Asia. Those are a wealth of information. I would caution anyone before they would decide to do another study or another report to first see what's out there, because the odds are they have it. Whenever people ask me about birth registration, I say, well, you can look online or look through UNICEF's 7,000 documents, and I'm sure it's there. So we've been working on birth registration since we have been digitizing since the 1990s at UNICEF, but we've been working on this issue from a child's right perspective for well over 30 years. So there's a lot of lessons learned in Latin America, in countries that now have functioning systems, and I think that's also a wealth of information to kind of look at the history and look at the past. For the ID4D CRVS one, that we do. That's coming together more and more, but UNICEF works very closely with Jonathan and ID4D under our mandate of birth registration, which is part under the Conventions of the Right for the Child, Article 5, for every child to be registered at birth. And so we work from a legal identity perspective for all children. And UNDP is the UN agency that does the other form of legal identity, which is the national IDs. And bringing the whole identity spectrum together, from digital identities to functional identities within the health system. UNICEF works across just about every sector. So we have immunization registries. We have, with WHO, the mother-child registries, looking at the continuum of care. Also, UNHCR has the refugee registration. There's so many different functional registrations which we could be doing better to kind of see how we can, coordinate these or look at these in a different way. So UNICEF links to our immunization programs to increase birth registration for children under 1 during immunization schedules. We also deploy mobile units to schools. So when parents go to enroll their children in school and they realize that you need a birth certificate to go to school, that they can actually receive a birth certificate there. And then harnessing the power of communities. But previously, someone mentioned that the parish records system, which I think the French had one of the oldest parish record systems, and then in maybe the 1600s they had a state record system. But if you go into some of these old churches, you'll still find the records of baptisms, marriages, and deaths. So right there, that's a wealth of opportunity. UNICEF's worked with some countries that have done one-stop shops. I think the more you can bring services, combine services, either leveraging health systems, leveraging things in the community, the better off we'll be.
Thank you. Thanks, Kristen. Tanja or Jenna?
I'll just touch on a few thoughts. I think Jonathan from the World Bank asked about use cases. One other that's been raised, I don't have direct experience with it, but that's been raised a number of times with me is insurance. So that's one sector that, in terms of the private sector, where there's a very clear use case for birth and death registration, and I think one worth digging into. And I think that question on use cases provides actually a nice segue to think about the investment the lack of investment or the financing challenge, and thinking about the way in which different actors in a country or in an economy have a use for birth registration in link to ID. And of course, there's another question that we've started to unpack here about the relationship between the two. But I think it would be really valuable to look at what's out there around these use cases and ask, are those users able to articulate the costs and benefits to them? That is, if you're a mobile company and you incur greater costs in verifying identity, what would be the return if you could save that money through a more effective system? Likewise, we think about, are we thinking about the use cases across government ministries in a way that helps us to understand the return on investment, and could that make a more compelling case? And so I think that multidimensional perspective, and I very much take Kristen's point, I actually think a lot of it is probably out there or exists in pockets. What we could do more effectively is bring it together to make a really compelling case to policymakers, and thinking about not only thinking about the full impacts of strengthening civil registration and gender from the perspective of different uses. So there's a human rights dimension, there are social dimensions, there are health returns, but there are also returns on the economy, and that can be a very valuable way, I think, potentially to talk about all of this. So I just wanted to sort of put that out there.
Thanks, Jenna. Thanks. So we're coming close to our time allotment, but we have 5 more minutes. So let's just get one more thing out of this the wonderful panel. And I was going to ask each one of you if you can just tell us, like in 1 minute, one opportunity that you would like to put on the table for planning and implementation for CRVS with a gender lens. What would that be? Should we start from you, Jenna?
Oh dear. We can't start at the other end. One opportunity?
Yeah. One opportunity.
Well, this isn't going to sound very creative, considering that we're all gathered here, but seeing that I'm first, I'm going to say I think that the 2030 agenda actually presents an opportunity. And I think we've been talking about that all day, but I mean, for every country that everyone in this room comes from, you find the right interlocutors in government, and they do care. They have signed up. There is a gender focus there, and as we've articulated, CRVS is clearly foundational for achieving the 2030 agenda. So.
Bravo.
I think I'm just going to reiterate our efforts to build the open CRVS standards-based system so that it's open source and available freely for all governments. I think there's a great opportunity for addressing several of the gender barriers, and it's in the works.
And we would learn more about
we'll learn more about it in the next couple of days.
Innovation conference. Sarah, over to you. One opportunity.
Yeah, I think I'd go to the role that different actors have in playing a convening role in bringing partners together. I think a lot has been both unearthed as well as brought forward today. And keeping that drumbeat on gender and CRVS is critical. I know, Shaida, when we spoke over the break, you said this is the culmination of a dream, this conversation today, that has been many years. And so I'd love to, I think, really reflecting tangibly on the role of different partners at multiple levels in ensuring that drumbeat is maintained. Yeah.
Last word you have, Kristen.
All right. Well, this is a big one. I know I say there's probably, if you have a question on this, it probably already exists, but there is one that does not, and UNICEF is trying to address this, and it's going to be all hands on deck because it is a critical gap in information, and that is biometrics for children. What are the appropriate uses of biometrics? What are the capture rates? How do you do that? Because children's biometrics change. And as we see biometrics being a requirement more and more in adults, how do we connect that across the life cycle? And then there are things about ethics and standards and security and all of that. So those are big question marks that we are looking to address. So that is a big opportunity if anyone wants to engage.
Well, thanks. Well, with that, I mean, we know that there's huge complexities in building blocks for CRVS system implementation, but gender agenda is also hugely complex. Putting the two together, you can imagine the complexity, and I think we've all felt that through the day in the discussions. But we are coming together. We're seeing a number of building blocks and solutions which are coming to table. We've seen that the partnership and bringing all the partners together, the role of convening, the role of technology and open source solutions. So a variety of solutions are being offered for the implementation. So for that, I'm actually seeing promising signs are showing up, Haishan. So it looks good from where I'm sitting that we see some progress to be made. So join me to thank this wonderful panel and of course all of you for sitting through this session till 4:15. The good news is we only have one more session. The bad news is there's no break. So we're just going to go right after this with Rina, myself, and Muntasir's help. We're going to the final session, which is the closing.